She had spent her whole life searching for something she never thought she'd find. But one ordinary day in a small cafe, a single glance changed everything. Who was this woman, and why did a simple pendant make her entire world stop? Watch until the end to uncover the shocking truth. Don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? Evelyn Monroe had spent a lifetime mastering the art of control. Every aspect of her life had been carefully managed, curated, and executed with the precision of a well-rehearsed symphony. From the outside, she was the embodiment of success, a name whispered with reverence in elite circles, a woman who had built an empire from the foundation of old money and raw ambition. Her wealth was staggering, her influence unmatched, and her reputation unblemished. But beneath the polished exterior, she carried a wound that had never healed, a scar hidden beneath the layers of silk and diamonds. The wound had a name, though she had never spoken it aloud for decades. A daughter. A child taken from her before she even had a chance to hold her. The price of obedience, the cost of a life dictated by power and control. And no matter how many fortunes she amassed, no matter how many victories she secured, the weight of that loss never diminished. 50 years ago, Evelyn had not been the formidable woman she was today. She had been young, foolish, and for the first time in her life, in love. James Carter had been unlike anyone she had ever known. A musician, full of fire and passion, with a smile that had melted through the carefully constructed ice of her world. He had played the piano like it was an extension of his soul, his fingers gliding over the keys with a kind of effortless grace that left her breathless. Their love had been reckless, consuming, and, most damning of all, forbidden. In the Monroe family, love was a luxury only afforded to those who could afford to be careless. Marriages were not made for passion, but for alliances, for the merging of fortunes, for securing power. James had been none of those things. He was black, a struggling musician, a man her parents deemed unworthy of even standing in the same room as her, let alone sharing her heart. She had been naive to think they wouldn't find out. Monroes did not keep secrets, not for long. It had started with the quiet warnings, the cold stares from her father, the veiled threats from her mother. And then, one night, it escalated into something much worse. She had returned home from one of their stolen nights together, her skin still tingling from his touch, only to find her father waiting for her in his study. His fury had been quiet, measured, more terrifying than if he had screamed. He had already known. He had already decided. She would end it, or they would end it for her. When she refused, the consequences were immediate and brutal. She was locked away in their estate, her every move monitored, every letter intercepted. She had thought she could outlast them, thought that love would be enough to break through the prison they had built around her. But then came the final betrayal, her own body turning against her. She had been late. Weeks had passed, and the truth settled into her like a slow-burning fire. She was pregnant. A child. James' child. Their love had not just been fleeting moments in the dark. It had left something real behind, something undeniable. The moment her parents found out, the stakes changed entirely. Fury turned into cold calculation. There would be no negotiation, no compromise. The child would be taken. There would be no discussion. Evelyn had fought. She had screamed. She had begged. But Monroes did not bend. They did not allow scandal to stain their name. They would erase this, the same way they had erased every other imperfection from their carefully constructed world. When the time came, they took her to a secluded estate, far from the city, far from anyone who might have helped her. She gave birth in silence, her cries swallowed by the oppressive walls that had become her prison. She never even got to hold her daughter. She had pleaded, reaching out with trembling hands, but the nurses had been deaf to her desperation. She only caught a glimpse, a tiny, beautiful girl with dark curls and soft brown skin, before they took her away. And just like that, she was gone. The child that had been hers, the love she had fought for, vanished into nothingness. But Evelyn had not let her go entirely. In the last desperate act of defiance, she had smuggled a golden locket into the swaddle of her daughter's blanket. A small, simple thing, a token of her love, of the life that had been stolen from them. It was all she could give her, the only proof that she had ever existed in Evelyn's world. And then she was left with nothing but silence. She had been forced to return to her life as if nothing had happened. Within a year, her parents arranged her marriage to a man of their choosing, a cold, transactional union that served its purpose in securing the family's name. She played her part. She smiled in photographs. She made speeches. She pretended she had never loved and never lost, but inside she was hollow. The years passed and the wound remained. No amount of wealth, no number of accolades could erase the absence of her child. Evelyn had tried to find her. She had hired detectives, scoured records, followed every whisper of a lead, but it was as if her daughter had never existed. The orphanage was gone, the paperwork erased. It was as if she had been swallowed by time itself. She didn't even know if her daughter was safe, if she had been loved, if she had ever known that a mother out there had never stopped searching for her. At 70 years old, Evelyn Monroe had everything most people spent their lives chasing: money, power, influence. She had amassed an empire that spanned industries, her name synonymous with prestige and dominance. But none of it mattered. Every triumph only reminded her of what she had lost. Every success was a reminder that she had built her life on a foundation of grief. She often wondered what her daughter had grown into, who she had become. Did she have a family, a life she loved? Did she ever wonder about the mother she never knew? Or had she buried that absence so deep that it no longer haunted her? Evelyn had told herself that some wars could not be won, that some wounds never closed, that the past was a thing best left buried. But the past had a way of resurfacing. And Evelyn Monroe had not yet given up hope. The cafe was an unremarkable little place, tucked away between towering buildings, a haven for those who sought a brief respite from the city's relentless pace. It was the kind of place Evelyn Monroe rarely, if ever, stepped into. Her usual haunts were grandiose establishments, five-star hotels, exclusive clubs, places where the scent of money lingered in the air like expensive cologne. Yet today, for reasons she couldn't quite explain, she had chosen differently. Perhaps it was the exhaustion that had settled deep into her bones, the weight of decades pressing down heavier than usual. Or perhaps it was something else, something quieter, something she didn't yet understand. Whatever the reason, she found herself stepping through the cafe's glass doors, inhaling the scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries. She moved toward an empty table near the back, her eyes instinctively scanning the room, a habit ingrained from years of navigating boardrooms filled with men who sought to challenge her. She had spent her life reading spaces, assessing threats and opportunities with a single glance. But today, she wasn't looking for business rivals or corporate alliances. She wasn't looking for anything at all. And yet, she found something, or rather someone. At first, it was nothing more than a passing glance, a young woman moving between tables, balancing a tray with effortless ease. She wore a simple uniform, black slacks, a crisp white shirt, an apron tied neatly around her waist. There was nothing outwardly remarkable about her, but something about the way she moved caught Evelyn's eye. There was a quiet confidence in her stride, a grace that seemed out of place in such an ordinary setting. It was the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. And then the woman turned, just slightly, the dim cafe light catching on the chain around her neck, and Evelyn's world came to a sudden, violent halt. The pendant was small, gold, slightly tarnished with time. An intricate etching of musical notes glinted faintly in the light. A familiar design burned into Evelyn's memory with the same permanence as the scars on her heart. The breath caught in her throat. The world around her blurred, the hum of conversation, the clatter of dishes, the hiss of the espresso machine, all of it faded into an indistinct haze. It couldn't be. It wasn't possible. And yet, there it was, undeniable. The very same pendant she had slipped into her newborn daughter's swaddle all those years ago. Evelyn's pulse pounded in her ears, a frantic, disbelieving rhythm. She forced herself to breathe, to remain still, though every fiber of her being screamed at her to act. Her mind scrambled for logic, for reason. There were explanations, of course. The pendant could be a coincidence, an heirloom passed down by an entirely different family. It could be nothing. And yet, deep in her gut, she knew. It wasn't nothing. The young woman moved closer, her expression professional but neutral, the look of someone who had been on her feet for hours and was simply going through the motions of another routine shift. When she reached Evelyn's table, she offered a polite smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Can I get you something to drink?" The voice was smooth, practiced, with just a hint of fatigue. Evelyn heard it distantly, as though from underwater, as though the weight of 50 years had settled upon her in an instant. She opened her mouth, but no words came. She could only stare, her carefully maintained composure unraveling at the seams. The young woman frowned slightly, tilting her head. "Ma'am?" Evelyn inhaled sharply, forcing herself to speak, to hold on to the control that had defined her entire life. "Just a coffee," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. The woman nodded, scribbled something on a notepad, and walked away. Evelyn watched her go, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table, nails digging into the polished wood. She needed to be sure. She couldn't afford to be wrong. As the minutes passed, she studied the woman's every move, searching for traces of herself, of James, of the past she had never been able to reclaim. And it was there, in the small things. In the slight furrow of her brow when she concentrated, in the quiet way she carried herself, in the fleeting expressions that flickered across her face when she thought no one was looking. But it was the pendant that held Evelyn's gaze. That tiny piece of metal that had somehow impossibly found its way back to her after half a century. When the woman returned with the coffee, Evelyn forced a smile, though her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the cup. She hesitated for only a moment before speaking, her voice light, conversational, as though the question meant nothing. "That's a beautiful necklace." The young woman blinked, then instinctively touched the pendant, fingers brushing over the worn gold. Her expression shifted just slightly, something guarded flashing in her eyes. "Thank you," she said after a beat. "It's sentimental." Evelyn swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. "If you don't mind me asking, where did you get it?" The woman hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but Evelyn caught it. that flicker of uncertainty, of something unspoken. When she finally answered, her voice was careful, measured. "It was a gift," she said, "from my mother. Or, at least, that's what I was told." The words sent a jolt through Evelyn's entire body. She barely managed to keep her expression neutral, barely managed to breathe. The ground beneath her seemed to shift, reality tilting on its axis. This was real. This was happening. She had found her. For the first time in 50 years, the impossible had become possible. The past, the loss, the agony of all those years, it had all led to this moment. But how did you tell a stranger that you were the mother they had never known? How did you undo half a century of lost time? Evelyn looked at the young woman, her daughter, and knew that whatever happened next, nothing in her world would ever be the same again. The hours stretched unbearably long after Evelyn left the cafe. She returned to her penthouse, the skyline of the city sprawling beneath her feet, but for the first time in years she barely noticed it. Her mind was consumed with a single thought, a single undeniable truth. She had found her daughter. The girl with the quiet grace, the guarded eyes, the pendant that had once belonged to James. It had to be her. It couldn't be a coincidence. But knowing wasn't enough. She had spent a lifetime chasing ghosts, and now that she had found something tangible, something real, she had no idea how to hold on to it. She had left her number on the receipt, a simple message beneath it. "I think we should talk." It was a risk. She knew that. The girl, no, the woman, had no reason to trust her, no reason to believe the words of a stranger. But Evelyn couldn't let this slip away. Not now, not after all these years. Every hour that passed without a call gnawed at her insides. She had spent her life making decisions with precision, dictating the course of her own fate. Now, for the first time in a long time, she was powerless, and it terrified her. The call came late at night. The phone vibrated against the glass table, shattering the quiet. Evelyn's hands trembled as she reached for it. An unfamiliar number. She answered immediately, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Hello?" Silence stretched across the line, then a breath. "I don't know who you think you are," the voice said, sharp, clipped, laced with anger, "but I don't appreciate whatever game you're playing." Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, forcing herself to steady her emotions. She had expected this. She had prepared for it. But hearing the hostility in her daughter's voice still cut her deeper than she had anticipated. "This isn't a game," she said, keeping her tone even. A bitter laugh. "Then what is it?" Evelyn exhaled slowly. "My name is Evelyn Monroe, and I believe I'm your mother." The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line was unmistakable. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. Then a single word. "No." The denial was immediate, forceful, but Evelyn heard the undercurrent beneath it. Fear, confusion, the mind rejecting what the heart already suspected. "I know this is a lot to process," Evelyn said carefully. "I don't expect you to believe me right away, but I recognized that pendant the moment I saw it. I gave it to you when you were born." Another silence. This one was different. Less sure, less absolute. Then a sharp inhale. "That doesn't mean anything," the voice snapped. "I grew up in foster care. I don't know where this necklace came from. For all I know, it was just something the system gave me." Foster care. The word hit Evelyn like a physical blow. She had always known her daughter had been taken from her, had been placed somewhere beyond her reach. But she had clung to the desperate hope that she had been adopted by a family, that she had been loved. The thought of her child being passed around alone, unwanted, made her stomach twist with a pain she had no name for. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "I don't know what you were told," she said, "but I swear to you, I never abandoned you. You were taken from me." A sharp, bitter scoff. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to just appear out of nowhere and pretend to care." Evelyn's grip on the phone tightened. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but please meet with me. Let me explain." Another pause, then, "I don't know if I want to hear anything you have to say." "I understand." The words nearly choked her, but she meant them. The silence stretched so long that Evelyn thought she had hung up. Then a sigh. "I'll think about it." And then the line went dead. Evelyn sat in the stillness of her penthouse, staring at the phone in her hands. She had found her daughter, but finding her was only the beginning. The real battle had just begun. The waiting was unbearable. Days passed without a word. Evelyn buried herself in work, drowning in board meetings and negotiations, but her mind remained elsewhere. She had never been one to wait. She was a woman of action, a force that dictated the pace of her world rather than being at its mercy. But now she had no choice. This was something she couldn't control, couldn't manipulate into submission. And that made the waiting all the more excruciating. On the fourth day, her phone rang. It was late, the city lights painting long shadows across her floor-to-ceiling windows. The number was unfamiliar, but she knew. She knew before she even answered. "I don't know why I'm calling," the voice said as soon as Evelyn picked up. It was quieter this time, less sharp. "But you are." A pause, then, "Yeah." Evelyn let the silence settle between them, afraid that if she pushed too hard, she would break whatever fragile thread was holding this conversation together. "Where do you want to meet?" her daughter asked finally. It took a moment for the words to register. Evelyn exhaled, forcing herself to stay calm. "Anywhere you feel comfortable." Another long pause, then a decision. "The same cafe, tomorrow morning, 9. And then, just like before, the line went dead before Evelyn could say anything more. The next morning, Evelyn arrived at the cafe half an hour early. She had spent decades controlling every aspect of her life, yet now she felt utterly unprepared. She ordered a coffee but barely touched it, her fingers tapping restlessly against the ceramic cup. Every time the door opened, her breath caught. And then, at precisely 9, she walked in. The woman was different today, less composed. There was tension in her shoulders, hesitation in her steps. Her curls were pulled back into a loose bun, and she wore a dark jacket, as if she needed the extra layer to shield herself from whatever this conversation might bring. Her eyes scanned the cafe, and when she spotted Evelyn, she hesitated. Then, finally, she moved toward the table. Neither of them spoke at first. The weight of what they were about to discuss pressed down on them both. Finally, her daughter sat down, folding her arms across her chest. "So," she said, "talk." Evelyn had rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times, but now that the moment was here, the words felt heavier than she had imagined. She took a breath, steadying herself. "I never wanted to give you up," she said finally. "They took you from me." A bitter scoff. "Who?" "My parents." The word tasted like regret. "The Monroes. They were powerful, controlling. They believed that my relationship with your father was a disgrace." The woman stiffened at the mention of her father. "Who was he?" Evelyn hesitated. "His name was James Carter. He was a musician." The reaction was immediate. a sharp intake of breath, a flicker of something unreadable in her expression. "What?" Evelyn pressed forward. "I loved him. We loved each other. We wanted to keep you, but they—" She faltered. "They took you from me." Her daughter looked away, her fingers absently brushing against the pendant around her neck. "I don't know what to do with this." Evelyn swallowed hard. "You don't have to decide anything right now." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, the woman stood. "I need time." Evelyn nodded. "Take all the time you need." Her daughter hesitated. Then, finally, she said, "My name is Leah." It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time in 50 years, Evelyn felt something close to hope. The days that followed were an excruciating test of patience. Evelyn had spent a lifetime making things happen on her terms, bending the world to her will with precision and determination. But this was something she couldn't control. Leah had walked away, and Evelyn could do nothing but wait, unsure if she would ever hear from her again. The silence gnawed at her, an unfamiliar weight pressing against her chest. She reminded herself that Leah had given her something precious before she left. Her name. It wasn't acceptance, but it was an opening, and Evelyn clung to it like a lifeline. Weeks passed with no word. Evelyn busied herself with work, attending meetings, overseeing business deals, managing charities. But everything felt secondary, unimportant. Her mind remained tethered to the cafe, to the moment Leah had looked at her and, just for a second, hesitated before leaving. She wanted to believe that meant something. Then, one evening, as the city sprawled in glittering lights outside her penthouse windows, her phone vibrated on the marble counter. She froze, staring at the number, an unfamiliar one, yet one she had memorized in an instant. With a steadying breath, she answered. "I don't know why I'm calling." Leah's voice was quieter this time, less defensive but still carrying an edge of uncertainty. Evelyn didn't let herself exhale too loudly. "But you are." A pause. "Yeah." She could hear the noise of the city in the background, cars passing, distant voices. Leah was out somewhere, moving through her life as if this conversation wasn't shifting the ground beneath them both. "I've been thinking," Leah continued, "about what you told me." Evelyn stayed silent, giving her space. "I don't know what I expected when I met you," Leah admitted. "Maybe I thought you'd try to make excuses, try to say it wasn't your fault. But you didn't." A breath. "And I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything right now," Evelyn said. "There's no timeline for this." Another pause. "I guess I just keep coming back to the same question," Leah said. "What now?" It was a fair question. It was the only question that mattered. Evelyn hesitated before answering. "That's up to you." Silence stretched between them again. Then, finally, Leah spoke. "I don't want to pretend like we're something we're not. I don't know you, and you don't know me." "That's true. But—" Leah's voice was uncertain, hesitant. "I guess I want to." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, the words settling deep into her chest. "Then let's start there." Their next meeting was different, less tense. Leah still carried that guarded expression, still held herself like she was preparing for something painful, but she had come. That was enough. They sat across from each other at a quiet restaurant, Leah studying Evelyn in the dim lighting as if trying to make sense of her. Evelyn let her. She didn't push, didn't try to force a connection that had been severed for 5 decades. Instead, she listened. She learned that Leah had spent her childhood bouncing between foster homes, never staying anywhere long enough to feel rooted. She had learned to rely on herself early, had worked through school, had built a life on sheer determination and resilience. I used to dream that my mother would come find me, Leah admitted, stirring her drink, that one day she'd show up and take me away from everything. She shook her head. Then I got older and stopped believing in things like that. Evelyn's throat tightened. I wish I had found you sooner. Leah looked at her then, something unreadable in her gaze. Me too. It wasn't an acceptance, not entirely, but it was something. The weeks that followed were slow, careful. Evelyn let Leah set the pace. They met for coffee, for walks, for small moments that gradually filled the silence between them. Leah still had questions, still had doubts, but she was willing to let Evelyn be there. That was more than Evelyn had ever dared to hope for. One evening, Evelyn invited Leah to her home. She hadn't expected her to say yes, but she did. When Leah arrived, she looked around the penthouse with wary curiosity, trailing her fingers lightly along the marble countertops. "This is a lot," she said finally. Evelyn let out a small chuckle. "I suppose it is." Leah turned to her. "Did you ever think about what it would have been like if I had grown up here?" Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. "Every day." Leah was silent for a long moment, then exhaled and moved to sit on one of the stools by the kitchen island. "Tell me more about him." Evelyn didn't need to ask who she meant. She told Leah about James, not just the facts, but the little things. The way he played the piano late into the night, the way he hummed absent-mindedly when he was thinking, the way his laughter had filled a room. She told her about their dreams, their plans, the life they had imagined before it had been stolen from them. Leah listened, her expression unreadable. When Evelyn finished, she reached up and touched the pendant around her neck as if grounding herself in the connection that had survived all these years. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready to call you Mom," Leah said quietly. Evelyn felt a sharp sting of pain, but she didn't let it show. "That's okay." Leah met her gaze. "But I want to keep getting to know you." Evelyn swallowed past the lump in her throat. "That's all I could ask for." As they sat there, the city stretched out beyond them, the skyline painted in soft golds and deep blues. There was still so much between them, so many things that couldn't be fixed, so many years that couldn't be reclaimed. But they had something now. And sometimes something was enough. Some wounds never fully heal, and some answers come when you least expect them. But in the end, it's not about the past. It's about what comes next. If this story moved you, subscribe for more powerful stories. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and let us know where you're watching from.